You know what frustrated me for years in the shop? I'd build something I was really proud of, a cabinet, a small table, maybe a jewelry box for my wife. And 6 months later, the joints would start showing gaps, little cracks opening up right where the wood meets. I'd glued everything, clamped it for hours, even used screws in some cases, and still, the wood found a way to move on me. Then, about 8 years ago, I came across a documentary about Japanese temple carpenters, and I watched these men assemble massive timber frames with nothing but wood, no glue, no nails, no metal fasteners of any kind. And these structures had been standing for hundreds of years, some of them over 1,000. I remember thinking, what do they know that I don't? That sent me down a path I'm still on today, studying how Japanese craftsmen approached joinery from a completely different starting point than most of us were taught. Today I'm going to walk you through 15 Japanese joinery basics that I believe every woodworker should understand. These aren't just exotic techniques to admire from a distance. These are practical, logical methods you can start applying in your own shop. And stick around to the end because I'll share a marking technique I picked up that completely changed how I lay out joints. Let's get into it. Japanese joinery, or sashimono and tsugite as they call it depending on the application, is one of the most refined woodworking systems ever developed. What makes it worth studying isn't just the beauty of the joints, it's the thinking behind them. Once you understand why these joints exist, you start seeing your own projects in a completely different light. So let me give you a little background first because the context matters. Japan is an island nation that sits right on top of major fault lines. Earthquakes are a fact of life there, and for centuries, wood was the primary building material for everything from humble homes to enormous Buddhist temples. So Japanese carpenters had a problem that most Western builders didn't face in quite the same way. They needed structures that could flex and absorb lateral movement without collapsing. Metal fasteners create rigid connections. Rigid connections snap under seismic force. So they developed joints that interlock, that distribute stress across multiple surfaces, and that actually get tighter under load instead of pulling apart. There's a guiding idea in Japanese woodworking that roughly translates to reading the wood. Every board has a grain direction, a crown, a tendency to cup or twist as it ages, and the craftsman's job is to understand that nature and position each piece so its natural movement works with the joint, not against it. I'll be honest, when I first heard that concept, I thought it was philosophy, not carpentry. But once I started paying attention to grain orientation in my own joinery, I realized it's the most practical advice I've ever received. Now let me walk you through these 15 joints and methods, starting with the most fundamental and building from there. The first basic every woodworker should understand is the concept of the kama-tsugi, or the sickle joint. This is a scarf joint used to join two timbers end to end along their length. What makes it different from a simple Western scarf joint is the hooked shape. Each piece has a tapered tongue with a step cut into it, almost like a barb. When the two pieces slide together, that hook locks them so they can't pull apart in tension. I tried cutting my first one in a piece of white oak, and I'll tell you, getting that hook to seat cleanly took me 3 attempts. But once it locked in, I couldn't pull it apart with my hands. No glue. Just geometry doing the work. The second basic is the aritsugi, the dovetail dado. Now we all know dovetails, but Japanese carpenters use a sliding dovetail variation that locks a shelf or cross member into a vertical post. The tail is cut at roughly a 1:6 ratio, a little steeper than what most Western guides recommend, and it slides in from one end. Once it's home, it cannot pull out. I use this constantly now for bookshelf construction. It's stronger than any dado and shelf pin combination I've ever used. Number 3 is the mortise and tenon, but not the way most of us were taught. In Japanese joinery, the tenon often passes completely through the mortise. They call this a toshi hozo. The through tenon is then wedged from the far side with small, Hardwood wedges that spread the tenon inside the mortise. What this does is create mechanical lock in every direction. The joint can't pull apart, can't rack side to side, and actually tightens over time as the wood seasons around the wedges. I switched to through wedge tenons on my workbench build 2 years ago, and the base hasn't moved 1/1000th of an inch. The fourth basic is understanding wood selection the way Japanese craftsmen do. They don't just pick a board for color or figure. They examine the end grain, check the growth ring orientation, and position each piece so seasonal movement works in their favor. Quarter sawn stock is preferred for joint surfaces because it moves less across its width. When I started being this deliberate about grain orientation, my gap problems almost disappeared overnight. The fifth basic is the koshikake aritsugi, which is a half-lap dovetail joint. Imagine a half-lap, but instead of flat mating surfaces, one side has a dovetail shape. This is used in timber framing to join horizontal beams at a corner, and it resists pulling apart in a way that a standard half-lap simply cannot. The dovetail angle is usually around 77 degrees, just enough slope to lock without being so aggressive that the short grain becomes fragile. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these ancient methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Kenji's Workshop, and it is a collection of 100 ancient Eastern woodworking secrets for the modern craftsman. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The sixth basic is the importance of the pull saw. Japanese saws cut on the pull stroke, not the push stroke. This means the blade can be much thinner because it's in tension during the cut instead of compression. My Japanese Ryoba saw has a blade that's barely 20/1000ths of an inch thick. Compare that to a typical Western back saw at around 32/1000ths. That thinner kerf means less material wasted and a smoother cut surface that needs almost no cleanup for joint fitting. Number 7 is the concept of the blind mortise with angled haunch. Japanese craftsmen frequently add a small angled section at the top of a tenon called a haunch. This haunch fills the gap left by the mortise slot and prevents the joint from twisting. What's different from the Western haunch is the angle. They often cut it at roughly 15 degrees, which creates a small wedging action as the joint is assembled. It's subtle, but it makes a noticeable difference in how solid the joint feels. The eighth basic is surface finishing with a hand plane instead of sandpaper. Japanese woodworkers use a kana, a pull plane with a laminated blade, to achieve a final surface that's smoother than anything sandpaper can produce. When I first ran my hand across a board finished with a properly tuned kana, I was stunned. The surface was like glass, and it had a depth and luster that sanded surfaces just don't have. Here's why. Sandpaper tears wood fibers. A sharp plane severs them cleanly. The intact fibers reflect light more evenly, and finishes absorb more uniformly. Number 9 is the nageishi joint, used to join a horizontal rail into a vertical post. This joint uses a tapered tenon that wedges itself tighter as it's driven home. The mortise is cut slightly narrower at the back than at the front, sometimes by as little as 1/32 of an inch. That tiny taper creates enormous holding power. I've used this approach on frame and panel doors, and the joints are rock solid without any clamps during glue-up. The 10th basic is understanding seasonal movement and designing joints that accommodate it. Japanese craftsmen expect wood to move, they don't fight it. In wide panel construction, they use floating tenons and slotted connections that allow a panel to expand and contract across its width without stressing the frame. This is something most of us know in theory, but don't always execute well. Studying how Japanese carpenters detail these connections taught me to actually build in the right amount of clearance, usually about 1/8 of an inch for every 12 inches of panel width in a typical hardwood. Number 11 is the use of layout lines that stay visible during cutting. Japanese carpenters use a marking knife called a shirabiki to score deep, precise layout lines directly into the wood. These lines are cut across the grain fibers before the saw ever touches the board, which prevents tear-out at the joint shoulders. I started using a marking knife instead of a pencil for all my joinery layout about 5 years ago, and the improvement in accuracy was immediate and dramatic. The 12th basic is the jigoku hozo, or the hell tenon. This is a tenon that has small slots cut into it before assembly. Thin hardwood keys are placed loosely inside these slots. When the tenon enters the mortise, the keys catch on a slight internal shelf and splay outward, locking the tenon in place permanently. It cannot be removed without destroying the joint. This is used in situations where the joint will never need to be disassembled, and it creates holding power that rivals any modern adhesive. Number 13 is the three-way miter joint, or sanmai hozo gata. This is where 3 pieces of wood meet at a corner, and each face shows a clean miter with no visible end grain. It looks impossible when you first see it, but it's really 3 interlocking tenons hidden behind those mitered faces. I spent a full weekend cutting my first one in some scrap cherry, and I probably made 10 attempts before I got it right. But when it finally came together, it was the most satisfying moment I've had in the shop in years. The 14th basic is the practice of fitting joints dry multiple times before final assembly. Japanese craftsmen will fit, disassemble, adjust, and refit a joint 4 or 5 times before they consider it done. Each time they're looking for high spots, checking for even contact across all mating surfaces, and shaving away material with a chisel 1 thin curl at a time. This patience is something I had to force myself to adopt. I used to fit a joint once, call it good enough, and reach for the glue. Now I fit everything at least 3 times, and the difference in the final result is obvious. The 15th basic, and maybe the most important one, is the idea that the joint should be invisible in the finished piece. Japanese joinery isn't meant to show off. The goal is seamless connections where the wood appears to flow from one piece into the next without interruption. This philosophy changed how I think about my own work. I stopped trying to make joints that impress other woodworkers and started trying to make joints that disappear. Now let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that Japanese joinery addresses completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for metal fasteners when a joint feels weak. Most of us do it because it's fast and it works in the moment, but metal and wood expand at different rates, and over time, that mismatch creates looseness. Japanese joinery solves this by making the wood itself the fastener. The second pattern is relying entirely on glue for joint strength. Modern wood glue is incredibly strong, but it's only as good as the surface contact and the grain orientation. Japanese joints are designed to hold mechanically first, so even without adhesive, they stay tight. The third pattern is using pencil lines for layout. A pencil line is roughly 1/32 of an inch wide, which means your accuracy has a built-in error right from the start. A knife line is essentially 0 width and gives you a physical trench to register your saw or chisel against. The fourth pattern is rushing through the fitting process. We test fit once, maybe twice, and then commit. Japanese craftsmen treat fitting as the most important phase of the entire build, and it shows in the final result. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a layout method I learned from studying Japanese timber framing, and I use it on every single project now. Before cutting any joint, take your marking gauge and scribe a line around the entire perimeter of the workpiece at your shoulder line, not just across the face, all 4 sides in one continuous line that meets itself perfectly. Japanese carpenters call this establishing the joint's foundation, and what it does is give you a reference that you can check from any angle during cutting. If your saw starts to wander on one face, You can flip the piece and check against the scribed line on the opposite face. It sounds simple, but this one habit eliminated about 90% of my shoulder-fitting problems. Try it on your next mortise and tenon, and I think you'll see what I mean. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best ancient Eastern woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Kenji's Workshop. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one.